As we look into the mortgage foreclosure crisis right here on Public Exposure, we have to dig deep, and we're digging really deep here. Thank goodness we have Ellen Brown, who's the author of Web of Debt, with us, because this is about one of our favorites on here, former Vice President Dick Cheney, who said deficits don't matter. And in fact, you're saying he's right.
Right.
How come?
Deficits don't matter because debt is our money supply. All of our money comes from debt. If we had no debt, we would have no money supply. This was said, for example, by Mariner Eccles back in the 1930s, who was head of the chairman of the Federal Reserve at that time. And he admitted to Wright-Patman in a congressional testimony. He said, Wright-Patman said, so where does the Fed get the money? And Eccles said, well, it's drawn on the credit of the people. And so Patman said, so it's all just debt. And Eccles,
so everything we have is debt?
Yeah.
That's a little depressing.
No, it's all an accounting entry. It's all debits and credits. In other words, all of money is now the government's money. The government's debt is the people's money. So somebody has to go into debt to create the money supply. And so if the people don't go into debt, the government has to go further into debt.
Which they do by borrowing money through bonds, and oftentimes the purchasers of the bonds are outside the United States.
There would be a better way to do it. Ideally, you would borrow it directly from your own central bank. That's what the Japanese do, for example. And they have a debt to GDP ratio of 226%, and the economy is still booming right along.
You know, as I was reading the blog and also in reading the book and preparing for this segment, you know, all I could see is this statement here about the public debt is the people's money, but all I could see is this land is your land, and then taking that off, but you know, this debt is your debt. But I mean, seriously, help me understand, help the public understand how what you're saying is that the public debt is actually the people's money.
Banks create credit, or when banks create our money. And so when you go to the bank to take out a loan, the bank just writes that money into your account. You give them, for example, a mortgage. And that, as soon as you sign the mortgage, that becomes a negotiable instrument, which is actually a form of money. So the bank puts that on one side of their balance sheet, and they write the money into your account on the other side of the balance sheet, and then you write checks on it and it goes out into the economy. So the thing about private debt is it all gets paid back eventually. So if you only had private debt, you wouldn't have a stable money supply. Only the federal government can keep rolling its debt over indefinitely, and it does. If you look at a chart of the federal debt, it goes back to 1835. It hasn't been paid off since Andrew Jackson, and ever since it's just gone up and up and up. And obviously it hasn't hurt the economy. I mean, we've been the strongest economy in the world for probably at least more than half of that time. So the debt was actually a good thing. You want debt the size of your GDP. In other words, you want a money supply that's the size of your GDP.
So basically, you do want your government to be, you know, broke or even.
Well, the government writes checks to for workers and materials, and that money goes out and circulates in the economy, and that's our money supply.
Okay. All right, well, we've got a chart about our debt, and we've got the gross debt versus public debt, and I need to understand what this exactly means. So let's go to that chart. It's headed up our debt. And there was, we looked at that chart. What does this mean here? In the 40s, it was it was 2 trillion, well, actually closer to 4 trillion, and then it'd go up, and now it's almost off the chart, literally. What does that mean?
Well, the public debt is that, and that chart looks like it goes up to 2000, is that a 7?
Yeah, it looks like 2010.
2010?
Yeah.
Okay, so the public debt there is at 10 trillion, although I think it's actually at 14 trillion now.
Yeah, 14 trillion now. So how does that relate to productivity, though? Because you talk about in your blog that debt.
Is there another chart on there?
Yeah, there's another chart. Let's go to that other chart there, because the debt and productivity are essentially related to each other.
Okay, so that's debt to GDP. So you can see that it was the biggest during World War II, and the debt was the largest during World War II. But because GDP came up, in other words, the debt never actually was paid down. It's just that we became more and more productive, largely because of World War II, which stimulated productivity. I mean, that's when the infrastructure was built. So the debt to GDP ratio has gone down, even though the debt itself, as we saw from the last chart, has just continued to go up.
You also say in one of the blogs that perhaps we should consider our national debt like we do public utilities. How so?
Money itself should be, credit should be a public utility because it's backed by nothing. It's created by banks. And really the function of the bank is just to oversee the deal. It's really people themselves who create credit. In other words, you are monetizing your own promise to repay. All the bank is there for is to guarantee it, to stand behind it, to enforce it, to make sure that everything's fair. So the bank is more like a legal system. It's more like a court. And of course you want public courts. You don't want private courts that can be bribed or, you know.
Oh, like the WTO. Oh, we won't go there, but we will be getting into in another segment, and I strongly encourage you to watch some of these other segments because we're going to be talking about the public banks, and the public banks themselves is something that you advocate strongly. Mm-hmm. And as we wind down in this particular segment about public banks, would public banks take care of all of these problems?
Public banks would be a start in the right direction. Yeah.
Okay. With that, we'll let that be the last word for this segment. Strongly encourage you to go to the website, webofdebt.com. Also participate in the blog, learn from the blog, and read Ellen Brown's book. And we'll see you right here next time on Public Exposure. Take care.